Welcome to the Austin Public Library podcast. My name is Julie Kleinfelter, director here at the Public Library in Austin, Minnesota. I mentioned the Minnesota part as we're often confused with the library in Austin, Texas, which is a much larger entity. So if you're looking for a podcast out of Texas, you may be surprised. Hopefully, pleasantly surprised. Don't stop listening. Just know that eventually, inevitably, we'll be talking about snow. For our inaugural year, this podcast is going to focus on a program called Reading for Life. Reading for Life is a movement of the imagination for the purpose of growing community around a shared love of literature. Structured like a book group, but one facilitated to maintain the richest possible dialogue among the participants and the source text, the presentations bridge great novels to dedicated readers. The idea is that real community begins and ends with our imaginations, and few resources, if any, are as vital to the imagination's development as works of literature. To help guide us on this journey is my co-host, Michael Verde. Michael graduated with honors from the University of Texas's Plan 2 honors program, earned an MA in literary studies from the University of Iowa, and an MA in theology from the University of Durham, England, where he graduated at the top of his international class. He taught for 15 years at the university and college prep school levels, most recently in Indiana University, and is currently completing his PhD with a focus on literature and religion. Michael founded Reading for Life in 2005. Welcome, Michael. I'm so glad to be here on this podcast with you.
Well, me too, Julie. I am just excited that the Austin, Minnesota Library is interested in Reading for Life. You may have noticed in the intro, I'm actually from Austin, Texas, or at least spent some time there. So there's just a nice connection.
Yeah, that is. We get phone calls all the time from Austin, Texas, and it usually takes us a few minutes to figure out that they don't really want us. They're happy to talk with us and chat with us, but at the end of the day, that we're not who they're looking for.
The accent doesn't cue them that they've miscalled?
Sometimes okay. Not so much. It depends. Okay. Depends on the day. All right, well, let's jump right in. What can people participating in Reading for Life expect from this program?
Well, they can expect to have their minds blown, and I mean that in a good way. So let's think of blown in the sense of breath and not a landmine. But they can expect to have their minds blown specifically about the dimensions of these novels they may not have previously noticed. And I expect the same for myself. And the reason for that is that these novels, the ones that we've picked, and it's true for great novels, period, they're inexhaustible. In other words, they're not really objects with a finite limit. It would be, I think, more meaningful to imagine them closer to beings, even human beings, than it would to imagine them as objects. And if you think about a novel in that way, then the idea that you've ever finished it or that you've completely comprehended, and the word comprehend really means that you've grasped it. It's entirely within your fist, so to speak. Well, that's just not possible with these novels. And in fact, the more time one spends with them and the more intimate one's imagination is with the novels, the more they open up into horizons that are deeper, wider, and further than even the last previous read. So I expect what's going to happen is going to happen to all of us. And that is literature is going to do something to us that is a real buzz.
Yeah. So as those of you who are listening can already hear, this is what I experienced the first time. I encountered Michael for the very first time on a podcast of a mutual friend of ours, Ben Mathis, and I was listening to the podcast. And at the beginning, Ben mentioned, if you're driving a car, this might not be the best podcast for you because you're going to want to take notes. And that was exactly what I wanted to do. I was driving home. It was a long trip. And at some point I ended up pulling over at a truck stop because I needed to write down some of the things that I was hearing. And Michael, you look at reading in a different way. And at being a lifelong reader, I remember being a little bit in awe of that because I felt like I was pretty good at what I was reading. I felt like I kind of got it, but you come at it from a level that's just different. And it really does bring the literature to life as its own its own live entity. And not only that, but the way you talk about it, my take on the literature brings something else to the piece of work itself. So I get to add to that piece of art through my interpretation, which is pretty exciting too.
Yeah, I would say not just a piece. The story, when you finish it, will be so, you will be so implicated in it in you, that it would be fair to say that the two are really inextricable. In other words, it's your imagination that's consummated the story. So I just want to emphasize and agree with you. You absolutely are an active participant, and probably far more than we're typically aware of. I mean, I think we generally imagine that writing is the active, that's the active contribution, and that reading is the passive contribution. And insofar as that's the case, then what it is that we're reading is not going to have an opportunity. It's not going to have an opportunity to be as energetic and as visionary as it is, because it's being filtered through whatever sort of receptors that we have. So if the book is plutonium and we've got receptors for coal, then we're going to get coal out of the book. But if you got receptors for plutonium, well, there you go. Some really cool things can happen. So I'm agreeing with you that reading in its most meaningful sense is as absolutely active in the reception as it is in the composition.
Most definitely. So how did Reading to Life come to be? How did you come to this place with this work?
Goodness, I grew up in a little country town, and reading really meant reading the Bible. I mean, this will sort of ring true with To Kill a Mockingbird as well, because it was a town actually even smaller than Macomb. So reading meant reading the Bible, this is fine. So, but the point about that is, when you grow up, as I did in the Baptist church, when you're reading the Bible, you're not just reading a book, you're actually accessing the entire architecture of reality. In other words, you're reading about what reality is when you're reading the Bible. It's not hypothetical. This is what reality is, from let's say from the zenith to the nadir, from your inception to your potential life in eternity. So all that to say is that reading was reading for life if you grow up Southern Baptist, because that's really what you're reading to do. So there is that connection, and I'm sure that has made a deep unconscious purchase in my imagination that books are ultimately vehicles in which your own sort of destinies at stake. So there's that. But then also at some point in high school, I looked around, and I love growing up in a little country town, absolutely tons of benefits to that. But in the town where I grew up, not everybody necessarily was aspiring to move away. And it just so happened that I was aspiring to move away. And at some point, I think it's early in my 10th grade year, I decided, and I don't know where the idea came from, that I was going to read my way out of this little town. And toward that end, I set myself a challenge of 100 pages a day, and that was 7 days a week. And I took that in real earnestness, and went to work reading myself to Austin, Texas, I guess you could say. So those are the personal connections to the phrase reading for life. And that has never ended. I took a year out of college, in fact, because I was frustrated that college was getting in the way of my reading. I mean, at that point, I became such a dedicated sort of reader that all of the things you had to do, get an apartment, wash your clothes, eat, all of those things made reading, it complicated my reading life. So I said, what can I do to make time stop and find a place where I can just read? And I had won a writing contest in high school for a magazine called Guidepost. And it happened to pay a lot of money to win this Guidepost story, $6,000. And at the time, I put it in stocks. I bought stock in Louisiana Pacific. That actually was a paper company. I didn't think about it at the time. But I dropped out of school, sold my Louisiana Pacific stock, and moved to Paris for the sole purpose of reading constantly. And I mean, 6 to more hours every day. So that reading for life is something that is, from Baptist Sunday school to even now, I really, at some level, am convinced that what it means to be me has something to do with how I read.
So you've really kind of lived that in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. And I'm sure we all are, if you imagine, really, and there's the key word, if we imagine, as you suggested about books, that reality itself is not complete until we participate in it. So not just a book needing me to read it. If we think of life itself requiring my contribution to be what it is, well, it's the imagination in both instances that is the ingredient that I'm contributing to life.
So as we started talking about this program and how we were going to pull this off in a community sense, and we got together and we picked out four titles, 4 books. So we have, as you mentioned, we have To Kill a Mockingbird, we have The Song of Solomon, we have Love in a Time of Cholera, and Jane Eyre. And those were the 4 that we're going to space out over the next year. And then in between, we're going to be doing these podcasts. So what we kind of wanted to talk about in this podcast was, the idea behind Reading for Life and how that was going to work, and then kind of introduce a little bit, how this is going to work and how we're going to do it. As we kind of begin this, you and I spent a lot of time planning for this, and as we begin this adventure, what are you most excited about?
Well, sharing this buzz with other people. You know what I mean? Any joy that you have, I think, is amplified by others participating in it. Emerson said that an experience is only half the experience. The other half is sharing it. And, that makes a lot of sense. People take trips, and maybe more than half the time they're gleaning images. So when their trip is over, they can share it with friends. It's almost like the trip doesn't end until their friends have seen the images. Well, that's what I mean about multiplying delight by more people participating in what it is that we're creating together. So that's what I'm excited about. And incidentally, I think excite is a particularly good word. And I mention it because it happens to be a crucially important word in The Great Gatsby. Because Daisy's voice excites, typically men, but excites people that come into its proximity. And there's a distinction sort of made between Daisy herself and Daisy's voice. Daisy's voice is almost like its own character. But I mention that because the verb that Fitzgerald uses with respect to Daisy's impact is excite, and uses it, multiple times. So at some level, it doesn't want you to miss it. And what's important about that is that the word literally means to heat up molecules. And what something is with respect to water, for instance, depends upon the speed at which the molecules are moving. So water molecules at one speed is ice, another speed is water, and another speed it's steam, which is to say that the exciting the molecules can transform the body. I mention that because that's a wonderful way to think about what great novels do. They excite the molecules of our imagination. And if they excite them to a sufficient enough degree, then what we see will be transformed. We'll be seeing it with an imagination that's operating at a different degree of intensity, even velocity. And it's through that perception that the world takes on the shape that it has. In other words, our perception is a crucial ingredient to what it is that we see. I mean, that's one of the most important discoveries of quantum mechanics, is that you can't measure what you're observing ultimately without taking the observer into the equation. So, which is to say that our observation is contributing to what we observe. And I am saying that great novels, great works of art, excite our imagination with the idea that at a certain degree of concentration, what we perceive will be somewhat of a different world, if not a significantly different world.
Yeah, that's the piece that made me pull over. I think when I was listening to the original podcast, I think that's really something that kind of makes you stop and think. And I feel like with the past year and a half with COVID and all the things going on, I feel like at least my community is really ready. I see an influx in reading, and I see an influx in the, not just in reading, but in the need for book groups where people are they're wanting to get together with people, and they're wanting to touch base and talk about these things. So I feel like this program is really primed because of what we've been through in the last year and a half. And I know you and I have talked a little bit about that, and how sometimes literature makes it possible to have conversations with people that you maybe otherwise don't have anything in common with. And that piece of work gives you that common ground. And I think right now that's really important. And I think it's something that people are really looking for and needing. And so I'm excited to see how that plays out in this.
Well, I hope you're right. I have that sort of feeling myself that I'm ready to be a part of people. I mean, just physically be in proximity of people without being self-conscious that we might, be in danger of killing each other, speaking of breath. So to be able to be close to people physically without that kind of, possibility hanging over your shoulder, well, that's going to be a delight itself. But then if we could say that we're going to come together to do something that is not antagonistic, so much of the discourse that we have access to publicly is basically designed to fracture people into enclaves of identity groups. I mean, really, if you look at the way most media works, it just brings people together, gives them one or two positions to identify with, and then gets them to bite and tear into themselves. It's almost like watching a chicken fight, except, a rooster fight, and we're the roosters. And the fact that literature invites us to communicate in completely different terms. In fact, you could share things at the level of the imagination with people that at the level of ideology, you don't share at all. In other words, we might be very different with respect to our ideological investments, but we might find at a deeper level of concern, you could say primary concerns, that we're actually we're not on two different sides at all. So I do think literature gives us a chance really to break through this kind of discourse that's designed to put people in their places, and that place is competitive with one another, into a way of coming together and talking so that you form a kind of body in which no one is the in group and no one is the out group. You don't have to have a them to be an us in the world of the imagination. I would say in the world of the intellect alone, dissevered from the imagination, you can't have an us without a them, which is why we're probably constantly generating them.
Good stuff.
Well, this is all stuff that's at the heart of To Kill a Mockingbird.
Right. I was going to say, so that kind of leads us into the first book that we're going to go through is To Kill a Mockingbird. And let's talk a little bit about what deep reading kind of looks like. And so Harper Lee talked about how To Kill a Mockingbird was a love story. What do you get out of that? Because I'm not sure I would have said that about that book in necessarily.
Well, first, I'm glad she said it. One, because it's kind of a teaser, because it on the surface, it doesn't fit the plot of a typical love story. Okay, it's not Jane Eyre, for instance. But there is a lot of allusions to wedding rings. The first being that the two Indian head pennies that come down the tree are in a box used for wedding rings. And then, of course, there's also a lot of talk about Scout and Deal marrying and even having them a baby. That becomes an important, and in fact, where babies come from. Because Scout's not sure. Now, at some point, Deal educates her where babies come from, but he has a kind of curious theory. He thinks that babies do come from people getting together, let's say, in a biblical way. He's aware of that, and he lets Scout know that there is a conjugal dimension of baby making. But he says there's also this man up in the sky that has a bunch of babies. And that when he breathes life into us, that's how we are let's say, that's how these babies are conceived through God's breath. So that's a very different kind of baby. And I'm saying all that because this novel is putting all those things on the table. So I'm guessing that this love story has something to do with not ultimately Scout and Deal, but Scout and Boo. And it could be that Deal and Boo are pretty much, I mean, they're pretty closely identified. It is Deal of the three children that's absolutely invested, certainly initially, in Boo coming out of his house. I mean, Deal jumpstarts the whole plot of the novel. And Deal is even described in a kind of translucent, pallid skin with hair that looks like it's kind of got a cowlick, but looks like a bird's feather. And when you look at descriptions of Boo and Deal, they're described with respect to their paleness and to their affinity with birds. They start to look like Boo and Deal are, deeply metaphorically identified. So if Scout's going to marry Deal or marry Boo, there may be a sense in which that's both the case. In any case, I would say that Scout definitely marries Boo at the end of the novel. And I mean that when he escorts her back to his house, this is after he's saved Jim and Scout from Bob Ewell. Scout says that not only is she going to go back to Boo's house with him, but that Boo is going to escort her as is proper. He's going to lead her. And when they arrive back at his house, he goes into the house and she says, and I never saw him again. Now, Scout's 8 years old. This guy just saved her life. So if we're thinking of things that are plausible in a semi-real world, that's not very plausible that the person who just saved her life, that she's never going to see him again, because we don't have any indication that he passed away. But then, interestingly enough, after he passes into the house, she goes and stands in front of the window. She stands in front of the window through which Boo has been watching Macomb and watching her and Jim, presumably for their whole lives. She's looking now out of Boo's window. And incidentally, the title, Go Set a Watchman, is probably very much related to this image because Boo is a watchman. But when Scout sees Macomb from Boo's window, she remarks, I'd never seen Macomb from this angle before. And she further stresses that although it is nighttime in Macomb, it is daytime in her mind. In other words, she's seeing by a light that's not the light of nature. She's seeing by some other light around. She stresses that. And furthermore, she sees Macomb in all four seasons simultaneously. So this is not a sight. This would be vision, what Joyce would call epiphany. A fancy word is apocalypse. It's a revelation of how things are. She's seeing things in a different light that reveals them to be very different than the Macomb she had previously seen. Now, I mention all that because I'm hypothesizing the reason that she never sees Boo again is because for the rest of her life, she's going to see with Boo. That Boo didn't just pass inside of his house, he passed inside of her. And there's no reason to think that this is crazy talk because the entire novel, in some sense, is predicated around Atticus and joining Scout. Scout, there's this one simple trick that if you learn it, you'll get along better with people. And what is that trick? It's to see the world from their eyes or to climb into their skin and walk around it. In other words, Atticus has told Scout until she enters the skin of another person. You could only do that if there was a ghost-like essence that was communicable. So I'm saying that actually Boo goes into Scout and that is the wedding prefigured in that gift of the two Indian heads. And that's the love, really. That's what makes it a love story. Harper Lee did mention that a lot of people would ask her, are you Scout in the novel? Because, she's was known to be a tomboy. And she surprised a lot of people by saying, no, if anybody, I'm Boo. That also makes sense because Boo's first name, his real first name is Arthur. So it makes sense that the author of the novel would identify with author. And it also suggests that maybe Boo is in some way writing this book as much as Harper Lee is. And I think that should be taken in real earnestness. If one reads Go Set a Watchman, and I'll be honest with you, it is one of the, and I don't mean this to be mean, it's one of the most boring books I've ever read in my life. It's absolutely painful.
I'd heard that. When it came out, I remember being a little surprised at the review.
I understand why she probably didn't want it published. It's a terrible, well, terrible is not a right word. Okay. First of all, if you can write a novel at all, it's not terrible. Flannery O'Connor said that no superficial mind ever wrote a novel. So I'm not going to say that, but I'm going to say it's, for me, was tedious beyond maybe a second read, which makes the fact that To Kill a Mockingbird as the most popular book in most surveys to have ever been written. What happened between the Go Set a Watchman draft and what we now know is To Kill a Mockingbird? And I'm suggesting something very unusual happened. And I would say that the imagination and its entering into Harper Lee is probably a part of that unusual thing that happened, that in some real sense, Boo probably did participate in writing this novel. And isn't that what every author says about his or her muse?
I was going to say the muse. That's the muse idea, right?
That's the muse. And every great author, if you talk to them about writing a novel, they pretty quickly will move to metaphors related to being a midwife, having participated in something. Keats said that every poet has a negative capacity, and he meant by that the ability to absent the ego. So great writing may have as much to do with absenting the ego as it has to do with being really proficient at words. In fact, those two things may have a lot to do with each other, that the less our ego is involved in the composition, the more powerful, because more filled with the spirit, the work will be. So I think that this is a love story. I think that Boo and Scout wedded, and that their child, so to speak, is this novel.
Interesting. Well, that right there is such a great introduction into, I think, and I hope, what the conversations are going to be like as we move forward in this. Do you have any thoughts or suggestions for how participants should prepare for this?
Well, I tell myself, until I've read a novel 3 times, I haven't read it once. And I mean that really. So the best way to prepare would be to reread these novels. Again, if we think about these novels as more like beings or living organisms, the fact that someone may have read it in high school, I mean, it'd be like saying, I'm 54. So the last time I saw this person would be like when I was 15, and I somehow kind of really think I understand them. Well, that would be obviously a delusion. Well, that's sort of how I'd say it is with these books, maybe even more so. So rereading the books is a great thing. But if a person doesn't have time, they're still going to get a charge out of this. It's just the charge will be exponentially greater the more familiar a person is with the language, because the more the more readily they'll be able to see how these different images are coming together in unexpected ways. That would be so that's what I would say. Reread these guys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm To Kill a Mockingbird, I read in high school and in college and after college. So I'm excited to read it again and see, because it was different every time I read it, because I was different every time I read it. And I've read a couple of the others too, but not as well as this one. So I feel like I have some reading to do to catch up too.
Great. I would say one of the ways you may have been different between readings is because of the influence of To Kill a Mockingbird. In other words, after you read it once, Heraclitus said you can't step into the same river twice. Well, I would say you can't step into the same great novel twice, because the second time you go to put your foot down, the novel will have already changed you.
Yeah. That's again, I get goosebumps, because those are the kinds of things that I think are really interesting, and that the novel itself is not a concrete piece that doesn't change. And part of it is because what the reader brings. So that's very exciting. Any other last thoughts on this initial initial podcast as we kind of bring people in and with the hope of, not only listening to the podcast and participating in the lectures, but also hopefully getting together within their communities to talk about these kinds of things in between.
Yeah, I think that last piece would be a real huge coup if you could help sort of structure that as a library and a library system, that after having a kind of, let's just say, you give a stimulating presentation that gets those molecules excited. Well, I think that the most obvious next step would be that those people with excited imaginations could find themselves in a common space with the right kind of atmosphere for sharing. And this is crucial. The atmosphere has to be right. A lot of really dedicated readers get frustrated with book clubs because often it's difficult to maintain a conversational thread, to maintain it at all, much less to develop it in increasingly deeper waters. So that can be difficult. And then if you throw in problematic personalities that dominate the conversation, well, then your idea that you're going to get together and share and love of literature with people can be greatly disappointing. Well, that could happen too with any discussion. So I think what would be crucial in bringing people together, but also establishing some kind of ground rules related to the way we're going to talk here. And I think it would be a very different way than what we typically see reflected back to us in most forms of media. And in this sense, I think libraries have a really crucial role to play. And I mean specifically by being able to host a different way of talking.
Yeah, I think we'll have more conversation on that, I imagine, hopefully in future podcasts as this gets going. So,
well, I would be interested to hear from you and other librarians and other people too, how that could come to be. In other words, I don't imagine that I have the magic formula for that. I just know that getting people together is only half the challenge. The next half is how we're going to communicate so that we end up with a community. Because everywhere I look, people communicate and they're ending up with a civil war. So is there a way that we can talk that moves in the opposite direction? And by the way, speaking of civil war and bringing people together in a union, I just finished Lincoln in the Bardo, and I have to say it's one of the 10 best books I've ever read in my life. It, absolutely mind-blowing. Anyway, that partly of what's at stake in that book is how to have a union. I mean, obviously, Abraham Lincoln is a kind of figure of bringing the union. In some ways, Lincoln was the best hope for remembering the dismembered nation. The we in the Queen's English suggests that the Queen, in some sense, is symbolizing the whole country, or the king, right? So in one sense, it's not just the king as an individual, unique identity. The king is a representative body of the whole nation. And I'm saying that Saunders was taking that same notion in Lincoln in the Bardo, but making Lincoln's body the common, let's say, common ground in which the Union's destiny depended. Could Lincoln, within his imagination, imagine how people who were at that moment, acrimoniously divided, could Lincoln imagine a way that those divisions could be healed? And clearly the crucial ingredient was the imagination. So anyway, the point is that what we're invested in doing is something that literature itself is invested in doing. And that's why I think we got more than just a prayer here to realize it.
To get somewhere. Awesome. Well, I also foresee many suggested book readings as we go along with this podcast between the two of us. So wonderful. That's great. Great. I know. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much. We'll sign off here for this first podcast and hope to see you all in person soon. Thank you for joining us, and we will talk to you again soon.
See you later, Julie. Thank you.